presentation is designed to give you an understanding of the expenditure on aquaculture research and development in a UK context. This presentation is effectively brought to you through the Scottish Aquaculture Research Forum, or SARF, but the data provided was sponsored, the data collection provided in the database was sponsored by DEFRA. What I hope to do over the next few minutes is to provide you with an insight into what we call the UK Aquaculture R&D database, to give you some summary statistics on some of the projects that are embedded in that database, to look at the expenditure patterns for aquaculture R&D over the last decade, provide you with, if you like, an overview of what I'm calling the bigger picture in terms of investment in research and development generally in a European and international context, and then also to pose the question, how much should we actually be spending on aquaculture R&D? First of all, the aquaculture R&D database. Well, this was a concept sponsored by DEFRA. It began in 2004 and has run through until the end of 2007. DEFRA has provided the funding for FRM Limited to collate this database. All the major UK sponsors are asked to contribute data. They're not obliged to, and it's taken quite a lot of effort to engage with some of the major sponsors and to persuade them of the merits of contributing data to the database. But over the last 4 years, we've managed to collate in the region of 535 records dating from 1999. We do have records that predate 1999 from some sponsors, but those records are not generally very reliable, and whilst they are included within the database, we tend to exclude them from any analysis of the data. The data set consists of any project code that might exist, any project title, the start and end dates for a project. If possible, we try to include a more detailed summary or abstract of the project, an indication of the cost to the sponsor, the total cost of the project, which may be more than the sponsor's investment. We also provide a sponsor contact by way of an email address and an indication of who the main contractor was for the project. It's important to recognise that this is the only record of UK aquaculture R&D, and we tend to use it for strategic policy development and also in the context of project and program management. But what's important to recognise is that it can help to minimise duplication of effort, and it informs an important resource that we would encourage any research workers or indeed regulators or other bodies to look at and interrogate to find out what work has been conducted in the past and where they, for example, might look for answers to some problems that they may currently have. Work may already have been conducted and there may be results already out there that they may wish to follow up. If we look at the overall expenditure on aquaculture research and development, it's important to recognise that this is UK expenditure by the main UK sponsors, so there's no international or EU sponsorship included within this. But if we look at the period 1999 through to 2011, which is where we have records for and records of expenditure, the graph you see before you, on the left-hand axis, we have expenditure in millions. The right-hand axis shows total number of projects, and along the base we have years. The maroon-coloured lines are an indication of annual expenditure, and the blue line shows the total number of projects. The red circle I've included really highlighting the period 99 to 2000, where expenditure appears to be low. We're not sure whether this is real or in fact it's simply an artifact of some sponsors not keeping particularly good records even up until the year 2000. But we do have reasonably good records, and so therefore our anticipation is it represents possibly an overall increase in expenditure in the aquaculture sector over that period. For the period between approximately 2000 and 2007, we have very good expenditure records, and the decline in expenditure after 2007 is largely because we don't have a full data set, and we would anticipate, as projected by the blue arrow, that that would be filled in as we collate more data for 2008, 9 and so forth. The total cumulative cost to sponsors between 1999 and 2011 is in the order of 60.7 million pounds. That's approximately 76 million euros at current exchange rates. If we look at the average project cost, and ultimately we will also look at the duration between 1999 and 2007, we can see that there has been a general increase in project cost, which equates to approximately 3% per year, year on year. The mean annual project cost in 2007 was approximately £46,500, with a standard error of approximately £6,300. And as I've said, we're projecting an increase of probably in excess of 3% per year over that time period for each project cost. If we now look at project duration, on the left of this graph we have the mean project duration in days for each of the years, and what that graph is actually telling us is that the mean annual project duration between in 2007, for example, was 908 days. That's 2.5 years, with a standard error of 38 days. And this graph is telling us that whilst costs of projects have increased, what we're actually seeing in response to the increasing costs is not necessarily fewer projects, but projects of or more projects of shorter duration. If we now look at the sector breakdown, where is all this money going in terms of allocation of funds to a given sector? Well, from the top graph we can see that the vast majority is spent on salmonids. That's both salmon and trout research. It's not divided within the database because there is a considerable overlap between research conducted for salmon and trout. We also have what we call aquaculture general as being the next largest expenditure, and that tends to be far more fundamental projects on aquaculture, largely sponsored by the research councils and of generic interest to aquaculture, not any particular fish or shellfish species. So what we can see from this is in excess of a third of funding is spent on salmonids, approximately 15–16% on shellfish, and 8% on marine finfish. Very little is spent elsewhere on other fish, and very little on, if you like, things like algae or indeed ornamental fish. If we then look at this expenditure pattern over time between 1999 and 2011 on the lower graph, we can see that salmonid expenditure has essentially increased over the period 1999 to 2007. The red circle really shows what's happened within shellfish expenditure, and I'm really pointing out that between the years 2000 and about 2004 there's a blip in expenditure, and that's largely accounted for when we analyse it from increased expenditure by the Food Standards Agency on shellfish hygiene work, in particular the contamination of shellfish by fecal material, and also algal toxins work. If we now look at what subjects this money has been spent on, again over the same period, 1999–2011, we can see from the pie graph that the vast majority of expenditure has been on disease. 56% of all expenditure is largely on disease, and that's largely fish disease. Only 15% of the national R&D budget is spent on environmental concerns. This is in stark contrast to the Scottish Aquaculture Research Forum, where, as I'll show you in a moment, anything between 40 and 60% of the budget allocated thus far has been on environmental concerns. It's possible from this pie chart to also see that very little expenditure has been devoted, for example, to nutrition, economics and markets, and things like reproduction or socioeconomics and behaviour within aquaculture. And this is actually quite important because these are areas where we still have a number of questions, important questions to be answered, and we may wish to consider that these are, if you like, or have been Cinderellas when compared to the considerable expenditure on mitigating the impacts of disease. Again, now looking at how this expenditure's profile has played out over time, we can see that fish disease expenditure has increased as a proportion over time during the period 1999 to 2007. We can also see that environmental expenditure peaked around the period 2000 to 2003-4, and that's very much in parallel with what we saw within the shellfish sector. And it's quite clear that that environmental, or that injection of environmental funding, reflects the additional Food Standards Agency funding on shellfish hygiene issues. If we just turn to the Scottish Aquaculture Research Forum, as we're a relatively small player in terms of the overall budget, but it's important to recognise that if we look at the expenditure that this organisation has committed to on a sectoral basis, approximately 60% has been committed to salmonid research, 5% to shellfish, and approximately 20% to what we're calling aquaculture general, 15% to marine finfish. If we then look at the subject breakdown, this graph was produced in 2006-7 and represented 60% expenditure on environment, as opposed to the national expenditure profile, which suggests only 15% of national budget being committed to environmental issues. So SARF is clearly bucking the trend in this area. SARF's expenditure on disease is also significantly less than as would be reflected at a national level, where approximately 35% of SARF's funds is being spent on fish disease, as opposed to the 56-57% at a national level. If we translate that into a profile over time, we can see the disparity here in terms of overall expenditure, showing a massive increase at a national level in disease expenditure, and at a national level a gradual decline in expenditure on the environment. Finally, we will have a look at sponsor breakdown. In other words, what organisations are spending this money and where are they spending it. The largest single contributor to research in this area is essentially the Scottish Government, Marine Directorate, and they're contributing approximately 30%. Of the research councils, BBSRC is the most significant, contributing around about 30% of the total aquaculture R&D budget, with DEFRA weighing in at just below that at 28%. What's interesting to note is that SARF comes in at 5% of this total, making us essentially the largest independent sponsor of aquaculture R&D. Again, over time, it's possible to see that SARF expenditure really hasn't been introduced until 2005 and doesn't really have an impact until 2006-2007. The call-out box here really just emphasises the fact that SARF is now the fourth largest sponsor, but the largest independent sponsor of aquaculture research in the UK. I'd now like to take a big step back from domestic aquaculture funding and look at the broader picture in terms of research funding generally. So this isn't just aquaculture, this is funding of research generally. The figures provided in this graph have been taken from Eurostat, which is available on the internet. This is all freely available information. And what I've done is I've collated the expenditure of a variety of different EU competitors in the aquaculture field, together with the Japan, United States and Norway, and compared those to R&D expenditure within the UK. This graph actually is quite interesting because the red line also shows that on the percentage spend of gross domestic product on R&D, that red line represents the Lisbon Agenda target, and this is the target set in the year 2000, and it aims to make the region, i.e. the EU, the world's most dynamic and competitive knowledge-based economy by 2010. Now, if we analyse some of the results, what we have, for example, on this pink line, is the trajectory of the Japanese expenditure or percentage of gross domestic product spent on research and development in Japan, and obviously the trajectory is now well above 3%.